whistling in the walls. It started with a whistle, a soft, eerie tune that floated through the walls of my apartment late at night. At first, I chalked it up to the old pipes in my building or a neighbour playing music. But then I started to recognise the melody. It was always the same, a slow, almost playful tune, like a child skipping down an empty road. It came at exactly 2:33 a.m. every night, never a second earlier or later. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the sound crept under my skin, seeping into my dreams. One night I decided to catch the culprit. I stayed up, sitting in the dark with my phone in hand, recording. As 2:33 a.m. approached, my heart pounded. The whistling began, soft at first, then growing clearer. It was coming from inside my apartment. I turned on the flashlight. The sound cut off instantly. Silence pressed against me like a heavy blanket. I searched every corner, closets, under the bed, even inside the vents. Nothing, but I wasn't alone. As I turned off the light, something moved in the darkness. A faint scraping sound like fingernails against wood. My breath hitched. I slowly reached for the light switch, but before I could flick it on, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. A whisper, right next to my ear. "You found me." I screamed and bolted for the door, but as soon as I stepped into the hallway, the world around me felt wrong. My apartment door had no number. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The air was thick, humid, and carried the scent of earth, as if I had been buried alive. Then I heard the whistling again. Not behind me, not inside the walls. This time it was coming from my own lips. I tried to stop, but my mouth moved on its own, forcing out the slow, skipping tune. My hands shook as I reached up, feeling my face, only to realize my lips were gone. The skin was smooth where my mouth should be. The whistling grew louder, coming from nowhere and everywhere. A voice whispered in my ear again, playful and mocking. "Now it's your turn to hide." The lights flickered. The walls started to close in. And then, nothing. If you ever hear a whistle in your walls at 2:33 a.m., don't look for the source. Don't acknowledge it. And whatever you do, don't let it find you. Because once it does, you'll never whistle again. My brother went missing 10 years ago. He came back, but something is very wrong. When Parnell disappeared, I was 12 years old. He was 2 years older, wiser, stronger. He always knew what to do. One summer evening, he said he was going to the lake to check if it was safe to jump off the cliff. He never came back. They searched the woods, the swamps, combed the shore looking for a body. The police said that if he had drowned, he had probably gotten tangled in the plants at the bottom and they would never find him. Mum never believed that. Every night she sat by the window staring at the driveway as if he would appear there. 10 years later, he did. Mum called me, her voice trembling. "Ivory, come home. Right now. It's Parnell. He came back." For a moment I couldn't breathe. "What?" "He's here. He came home." I ran out of my office and drove as fast as I could. The road to my childhood home had never felt so long. When I turned onto the driveway, I saw police cars and news crews. Neighbours stood on their lawns whispering. I pushed through the crowd. And then I saw him. Parnell stood on the porch. And he hadn't changed. At all. He should have been a grown man by now, 26 years old. But he looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared. The same brown hair, the same loose Nirvana t-shirt, the same freckles on his nose. It wasn't possible. Mum held his hand as if afraid he might vanish. Dad stood beside her, looking stunned. I approached cautiously. "Parnell?" He smiled. "Hey, Ivory, you've grown." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. The police tried to find an explanation. "Mr. Carter, do you remember where you've been for the last 10 years? One of the detectives asked. Parnell shook his head. Number I went to the lake and then I was here. You don't look older or malnourished. Doctors say you're in perfect health. Parnell shrugged. I guess I was lucky. No one knew what to do. A person who had vanished 10 years ago had returned, unchanged, with no memory of where he'd been. The media went crazy. Reporters called us day and night. People speculated. Alien abduction, government experiments, time travel. Mom wouldn't let anyone question him, insisting he was her son, and that was all that mattered. But I knew it wasn't true. That wasn't my brother. That first night I couldn't sleep. In the room next to mine, Parnell lay in his old bed. I lay in the darkness, listening. Then I heard something that made my heart freeze. Parnell was laughing, but not like before. It was a quiet, monotonous giggle, repeating at perfect intervals, like an automaton trying to mimic human joy. In the morning, he sat at the table as if nothing had happened. Did you sleep well? I asked cautiously. He looked at me. Yeah, you. A smile. Exactly the same as yesterday. Perfectly identical. I started watching him. He didn't eat. He sat at the table, cut his food, put it in his mouth, but never swallowed. Later, I found it hidden in napkins. He didn't blink as often as he should. And his skin, it was too flawless. Up close, I noticed he had no pores, not a single blemish, not a single hair on his arms, as if it was a layer, not skin. Then came that night. I woke up and immediately knew I wasn't alone in my room. I didn't move, breathing shallowly. Then I heard it. I know you're awake, Ivory. My heart stopped. Parnell stood over my bed. I know you've been watching me. What are you? I whispered. He leaned in, and in the dark his eyes were black. Not Parnell. My heart pounded, my body frozen. Parnell, or whatever looked like Parnell, was standing over me, leaning in, his face inches from mine. In the moonlight, his skin seemed unnatural, too smooth, like a mask stretched over something I wasn't supposed to see. What are you? I choked out, unable to move. He smiled, perfectly. Teeth white, symmetrical, eerily uniform. I told you. His voice was too calm, too controlled. I'm not Parnell, but I'm trying. I really am. Trying? I jumped up, backing against the wall. I had nowhere to run. What do you want? I whispered. His head tilted at an unnatural angle. What everyone does. And what is that? I want to belong. In the morning I tried to tell Mom. That's not Parnell. Something's wrong, Mom. We have to... Ivory. Her voice was cold as steel. You don't get to say that. I stared at her, stunned. But he is Parnell. There was something in her eyes I'd never seen before, a warning. Don't question it. Parnell walked into the kitchen and gave me that too perfect smile. Good morning. Mom beamed immediately. Good morning, sweetheart. I made pancakes. We sat at the table, and I watched as Parnell picked up a fork and took a bite. But he didn't swallow. He just held the food in his mouth. And then, slowly, very slowly, took it back out and placed it on his plate. No one reacted. No one. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my room with a kitchen knife under my pillow. Something was very wrong with my family. When I heard footsteps in the hallway, I was ready. Parnell stood in my doorway. Ivory. I didn't respond. There's something you should know. I tightened my grip on the knife. What do you want? His eyes gleamed in the dark. This isn't our first time. I blinked. What? He smiled wider. You don't remember? He tilted his head. We've done this many times. The next days were a nightmare. I started digging through old records, articles, anything about my brother's disappearance. But there were none. No newspaper mentions, no police reports. As if he had never gone missing. But I remembered. I remembered the posters with his face on telephone poles, the cops searching the woods, the night Mum collapsed on the porch, sobbing when the detective told us we should start accepting that Parnell wasn't coming back. But now... I called the police. I want to report a missing person. Who? My brother, Parnell Carter. He disappeared 10 years ago. Silence. Sir, we have no records of a missing person by that name. That night, I tried to escape. I packed a bag, quietly opened my window, but as I jumped onto the lawn, I heard voices. Mom, Dad, Parnell, standing in the living room, whispering. He's starting to remember. We have to do it again. This time, it will work. This time? I froze. Then Mom said something that sent ice through my veins. Call the others. I turned, and Parnell was standing behind me, with that same perfect smile. I told you, Ivory. He stepped forward. We've done this many times. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just sprinted. The night was humid, the darkness thick as tar, but I knew this road. My whole childhood, I had run barefoot down the driveway, vaulted over the neighbour's fence, disappeared into the woods when Mum called me in for dinner. This time I was running from something much worse. I heard footsteps behind me. Not just one set. Mum, Dad, Parnell, and someone else. Their steps were unnervingly even, too synchronised, as if they weren't human. The forest swallowed me in seconds. Branches whipped my face, roots caught at my feet, but I didn't stop. My heart pounded, my lungs burned, and somewhere in the back of my mind a warning screamed, "Don't get caught." Not again, not again. Why did I think again? Did that mean this had happened before? I had no time for answers. When I reached the lake, I tripped over something and crashed to the ground. I pushed myself up to my knees and looked down. What I had stumbled over was a row of white, perfectly even teeth scattered in the grass. I didn't have time to scream. The water behind me bubbled. I turned and saw a reflection. Not mine, Parnell's, but not the one waiting for me at home. A different one. The one who had really disappeared 10 years ago. He was paler, thinner, his eyes wide open, lips moving soundlessly. Something was holding him down. And then that something started to rise. A hand emerged from the water. Then another. And then something stood before me, dripping with thick black liquid. It had no face, but it was trying to make one. The skin pulsed, shifted, features blended and reformed. For a second it looked like me, then Parnell, then Mom, and then... like nothing. This is not the first time. The voice echoed inside my head, like my thoughts were no longer my own. And it won't be the last. I couldn't move. And then I saw them. Mom, Dad, Parnell, and many, many others. They stood at the lake's edge, all smiling the exact same way. They were not human. My mother took a step forward, reaching out her hand. Come home, sweetheart. Parnell, the false Parnell, tilted his head. Or maybe you'd like to try again? I understood. I was in a loop. This had happened before, maybe 100 times, maybe 1,000. Every time I tried to escape, every time they found me. But not this time. I lunged toward the lake, toward the real Parnell. And then I felt something grab my ankles, pulling. Water filled my lungs. I saw only his eyes. You have to wake up, Ivory. And then, darkness. I woke up in my bed, but I knew it wasn't over. The man under the streetlight. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind where everyone knows each other. Kids play outside until dusk, and the worst crime was someone not mowing their lawn. It was quiet, peaceful, predictable. And even though everyone said it was the perfect place to live, I always felt that something was off. I can't remember when I first heard about the man under the streetlight. Maybe it was on Halloween when kids tried to scare each other, or maybe someone told me the story around a campfire. But everyone in town knew it. For decades, every night after midnight, a tall, thin man supposedly stood at the corner of Oak Street and Miller Avenue. He never moved. He never spoke. The streetlight above cast a glow, yet his face was always hidden in shadow. The older folks said he had been there forever. Some claimed that if you walked up to him, he would vanish into thin air. But if you ignored him, he would stand there all night completely motionless. Others swore they had seen his face, but no one could explain exactly what was wrong with it. When I was 12, I was walking home from the movies with my brother. It was late, quiet, with only a few streetlights breaking the darkness. As we turned the corner, my brother grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do you see him?" I looked up, and there he was. A tall figure, wearing a long coat, his face swallowed by shadows. I took a step toward him, but my brother yanked me back. "Don't go near him. Just keep walking." I didn't argue. We picked up the pace, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The man remained there, still as a statue. I never asked my brother why he was so afraid. But from that night on, I avoided that corner. 15 years later, I returned to my hometown. I had been living in New York, but I had to come back. My father had fallen ill and needed care. I hadn't been here in years, and it didn't take long to remember why. Everything looked the same. The same houses, the same streets, the same scent in the morning air. But something felt wrong. On my first night back, I couldn't sleep. An uneasy feeling kept my eyes open. After an hour of tossing and turning, I decided to go for a walk. I wandered familiar streets, passing darkened windows and parked cars whose owners were fast asleep. It was quiet, except for the distant sound of a barking dog. And then I realized where I was. I was standing at the corner of Oak and Miller. I looked up at the streetlight. Someone was standing beneath it. My heart pounded. It was him. The same tall silhouette, the same long coat, standing motionless exactly as he had when I was a child. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, to get as far away as possible. But something stopped me. I couldn't move. I willed myself to take a step, but my legs felt like concrete. I stared at him, and he stared at me. Or at least I think he did. I couldn't see his eyes. His face was still shrouded in darkness. I tried to speak. "Hey, are you okay?" Nothing. I wanted to step closer, but then something changed. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. But I felt it. His face shifted. I don't know how to describe it. Like it wasn't a face at all. Like it was just a shadow, pulsing, stretching, morphing. And then I understood. This wasn't a man. My heart pounded, my breath quickened, and suddenly I could move again. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I convinced myself I had imagined it, that it was exhaustion playing tricks on me. But I knew I had to find out the truth. I went to the town library and started digging through old newspapers. After hours of searching, I found the first mention. 1934. A young man, Richard Evans, was found dead under the streetlight at the corner of Oak and Miller. The police did not release details about the condition of the body, but witnesses claim it was strangely deformed. My pulse quickened. 1952. A group of teenagers claimed they saw a man under the streetlight. When one of them approached, he disappeared. 1978. A young woman went missing at night. She was last seen near Oak and Miller. There were more articles, each one connected to people who had either seen him or vanished near him. He had been there for decades, maybe longer. I couldn't breathe. I shut the newspaper and ran out of the library. Instead of going home, I went to my grandmother's house. She was one of the town's oldest residents, knew every story, every rumour. If anyone could tell me the truth, it was her. I knocked on the door. After a moment, I heard slow footsteps, then the creak of hinges. "Jack?" She frowned. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "I need to talk to you." She let me in and led me to the kitchen. The familiar scent of coffee and lavender filled the air. I hesitated, then finally asked, "Grandma, what do you know about the man under the streetlight?" She froze. Her expression hardened, lips pressing into a thin line. "Why are you asking?" I told her everything. That I had seen him as a child, that I had seen him again last night, that I had found the articles. She was silent for a long moment, as if choosing her words carefully. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "Did you see his face? But I think it was changing." She took a deep breath. "Listen to me, Jack. That thing is not human. It never was. Then what is it?" "No one knows. But one thing is certain. When you notice it, it starts to notice you." A chill ran down my spine. What does that mean? People who see him start having nightmares. They feel watched. Some of them disappear. But the whole town knows about him. Because everyone has learned to ignore him. It's the only way. I clenched my fists. But that doesn't make sense. If he's hurting people, why hasn't anyone done anything? Why hasn't the police? Grandma gave me a sad smile. And what would they do, Jack? Give him a ticket for loitering? Arrest a shadow? I had no answer. You need to leave town, Jack, and forget you ever saw him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow seemed longer, more unnatural. I felt like someone was standing outside my window. At 3 a.m, I heard knocking at the door. I froze. It was soft, steady. 3 knocks. I didn't move. Another 3 knocks. Slowly, I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. But when I looked outside, I saw the streetlight across from my house flicker on. And under it, someone was standing, tall, motionless, facing directly at me. Then I knew. Grandma was right. It had noticed me. And now, it was waiting. I couldn't look away. The man under the streetlight stood there, motionless. But I could feel his gaze, even though I couldn't see his eyes. I didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds, minutes. My heart pounded in my chest and my breath was shallow and uneven. And then, slowly, very slowly, his head tilted to the side. It wasn't a normal tilt. It was too smooth, unnatural, as if his neck had no bones, as if his body wasn't made of the same thing as mine. I stepped back from the door as if it had burned me. Don't pay attention to him. Grandma always said that was the only way. But how was I supposed to do that when he had already seen me? I didn't sleep until morning. I sat by the window watching the streetlight. At 4 a.m, the figure vanished. It just melted into the darkness. I don't know what I expected. Maybe that it would all turn out to be a dream, a hallucination. But when I looked at the door, I saw something that made it hard to swallow. On the wooden surface right next to the handle, there was a handprint, as if someone had pressed a damp hand against it. Only it wasn't a normal handprint. It had 5 fingers, but they were too long, too thin, as if they belonged to someone who shouldn't have them. The next day, I decided to visit my grandma. I had to know more. As soon as I crossed the threshold of her house, she looked at me and paled. "He found you." I didn't answer, but she must have seen it in my eyes. She led me to the living room and shut all the curtains. "Jack, you need to leave. Today." "Grandma, tell me the truth. What is this?" She looked at me seriously. "I don't know, but I do know that once he notices you, he doesn't stop. I don't understand." Grandma sighed and got up from the couch. "Come." She led me to a room at the end of the hallway, the one I had never liked. It was old, smelled of dust and lavender, and yellowed pictures of ancestors hung on the walls. She opened an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a small worn box. "This belonged to my father," she said quietly. I opened the box and found a few yellowed papers and a black and white photograph. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of a building. They were all serious, looking directly at the camera. But in the background, under a streetlight, there was a motionless figure. Tall, thin, face hidden in shadow. I shivered. "This is from 1928, Grandma said. "My father claimed he saw him for the first time then." I looked at her, feeling a chill run down my spine. "For the first time?" Grandma nodded. "After that night, he started having nightmares. He said he felt watched. And then—" She paused for a moment. "One night he just walked out of the house and never came back." I clenched my fingers around the photo. "And you think the same thing will happen to me?" Grandma didn't answer for a long time. "No, if you leave," she finally said. "You have to, Jack. If you stay, he'll get closer." I didn't want to believe it was true, but I knew I had no choice. I had to run. That evening I started packing my suitcase. I didn't care where I was going. The only thing that mattered was leaving this place as soon as possible. But then I heard something that made me freeze. A knock. 3 knocks. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. The knocking came again. I didn't step closer, but I knew. He was there, waiting. I didn't open the door. I sat on the bed waiting for the knocking to stop, and finally it did. But then I heard something worse. A scraping sound, like someone slowly dragging their hand across the wood. I felt it. If I so much as glanced through the peephole, it would all be over. So I didn't look. I sat there until morning. The next day, I got into my car and drove forward, never looking back. As I left town, I felt the tension slowly leave my body. Maybe Grandma was right. Maybe all I had to do was leave, and he would let me go. Everything seemed calmer. But as I merged onto the highway, something caught my attention. On the right side, a few dozen meters from the road, stood a lone streetlight. And under it, someone was there, a man in a long coat. I froze. "Number, that's impossible." I drove past. "Don't turn around, don't look." But in the rearview mirror, I saw the man under the streetlight slowly turn his head. He was looking at me. And that's when I understood. You can't run from him. You can only ignore him. But he will always be there, somewhere in the background, waiting.